The morning sun cast long shadows across the Navy base as Commander Jake Morrison walked through the veterans' gathering with his usual confident stride. At 38, he was one of the youngest SEAL commanders in recent history, and he carried himself like someone who had earned every stripe on his uniform through blood, sweat, and countless missions in the world's most dangerous places. The annual Veterans Barbecue was always a mix of old war stories and friendly competition between different generations of warriors. Morrison enjoyed these events because they reminded him of the long line of heroes he was part of. Today felt different, though. There was something in the air, a tension he couldn't quite place. As he grabbed a burger from the grill, Morrison noticed a small crowd gathered around a picnic table in the corner. An elderly man sat quietly, seemingly unbothered by the attention around him. The old veteran looked to be in his 70s, with silver hair and weathered hands that spoke of decades of hard work. What caught Morrison's eye wasn't the man's age, but the way the other veterans looked at him, with a mixture of respect and curiosity that seemed almost reverent. "Who's the old-timer?" Morrison asked Sergeant Rodriguez, one of his trusted team members. Rodriguez shrugged. "Nobody seems to know much about him. Name's Henry Walsh. Keeps to himself mostly. Been coming to these things for years but never talks about his service. Some of the guys have been trying to get him to open up, but he just smiles and changes the subject." Morrison felt his competitive instincts kick in. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on being able to connect with any veteran, regardless of their background or era of service. It was part of what made him such an effective leader, the ability to understand and motivate people from all walks of life. "Watch and learn," Morrison said with a grin, straightening his uniform shirt. He walked over to the table with the confident swagger that had served him well in countless briefings and negotiations. The other veterans stepped aside respectfully as the commander approached, creating a small circle around Walsh and Morrison. "Afternoon," Morrison said, extending his hand. "Commander Jake Morrison, SEAL Team 6. The old man looked up with clear blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His handshake was firm, stronger than Morrison had expected from someone his age. "Henry Walsh," the veteran replied simply. "Pleasure to meet you, Commander." Morrison settled into the seat across from him, noting how the old man's posture remained straight despite his age. There was something about Walsh that reminded him of the old-school operators he'd heard stories about, the kind of men who had fought wars with different rules and fewer resources. "So, Henry," Morrison began, using his most casual tone, "what branch did you serve in? You've got that look of someone who saw some serious action." Walsh smiled politely. "Oh, I did my time. Nothing too exciting compared to what you young fellas do these days with all your fancy equipment and technology." The deflection was smooth, but Morrison had dealt with enough classified operations to recognize when someone was being deliberately vague. It only made him more curious. "Come on now," Morrison pressed, his tone becoming more playful. "Everyone here's got their stories. I've been all over the Middle East, Afghanistan, places I can't even mention. Surely you can share a little bit about the old days." The other veterans had gone quiet, sensing the building tension. Walsh took a slow sip from his coffee cup and looked out across the base, as if seeing something that wasn't there. "Different times," Walsh said quietly. "Different wars." Morrison felt his patience wearing thin. He wasn't used to being stonewalled, especially not by a retiree at a casual barbecue. His success as a SEAL commander came from his ability to extract information, to push through resistance, and to never back down from a challenge. "Well, every operator has a call sign," Morrison said, his voice taking on a slightly mocking edge. "Even the old-timers. What was yours? Probably something like Gramps or Old School, right?" A few of the younger veterans chuckled nervously, but the older ones shifted uncomfortably. They could sense that Morrison had just crossed a line, though none of them knew exactly why. Walsh set down his coffee cup slowly, and looked directly at Morrison for the first time since the conversation began. His blue eyes had changed somehow. They were colder now, with a depth that seemed to hold decades of secrets. "Silver sky," Walsh said quietly. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from Morrison's face, as if someone had just punched him in the stomach. His confident smile vanished, replaced by an expression of shock and growing horror. That's not possible," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible. The name Silver Sky was known only to a very select few in the special operations community. It was a legend whispered in classified briefings, a ghost story told in secure facilities, a name that appeared in files so classified that even Morrison's security clearance barely allowed him to know of its existence. Silver Sky wasn't just any call sign. It belonged to the most successful covert operative in American military history, a man who had single-handedly changed the course of multiple conflicts during the Cold War. The operations attributed to Silver Sky were the stuff of legend. Impossible missions accomplished with surgical precision, enemy strongholds that simply disappeared overnight, intelligence coups that had shaped decades of foreign policy. But according to every official record Morrison had ever seen, Silver Sky had died in 1975 during a classified operation in Southeast Asia. The man was a ghost, a legend, a symbol of what one person could accomplish when the stakes were impossibly high. Morrison's mind raced as he stared at the elderly man sitting calmly across from him. Could this really be the same person? The timelines would work. Walsh appeared to be the right age, but it seemed impossible that such a legendary figure would be sitting at a routine veterans barbecue, content to be dismissed as just another old-timer. "I think there's been some mistake," Morrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. Walsh smiled that same polite smile, but now Morrison could see something else behind it. A lifetime of keeping secrets, of carrying burdens that would crush ordinary men, of living with the weight of history that most people would never know. "No mistake, son," Walsh said gently. "But like I said, different times, different wars." The gathering around them had gone completely silent. Even the veterans who didn't understand the significance of the name could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Morrison sat frozen, trying to process what he had just learned, while Walsh calmly finished his coffee as if nothing extraordinary had happened. For the first time in his decorated career, Commander Jake Morrison found himself completely out of his depth, sitting across from a man whose very existence challenged everything he thought he knew about military history and the legends that shaped it. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Morrison's mind was spinning, trying to reconcile the quiet old man in front of him with the legendary operative whose exploits had been whispered about in the highest levels of military intelligence. "You're him," Morrison said finally, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're actually Silver Sky." Walsh looked around at the circle of veterans who had gathered, noting their confused expressions. Most of them had never heard the name, but they could see the profound effect it had on their SEAL commander. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," Walsh suggested, standing with the fluid movement of someone much younger than his apparent age. Morrison nodded numbly and followed Walsh away from the crowd, toward a quieter area near the base's memorial garden. His legs felt unsteady, and he realized that for the first time since he was a raw recruit, he was genuinely intimidated. As they walked, Morrison's training kicked in, and he began to study Walsh more carefully. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see the signs that had been hidden in plain sight. The way Walsh moved with deliberate precision, never wasting energy or motion. The way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, cataloging potential threats and escape routes. The subtle scars on his hands that spoke of close-quarters combat and dangerous work. They sat on a bench overlooking the memorial wall, where hundreds of names were etched in black granite. Walsh stared at the names for a long moment before speaking. "You know," he said quietly, "there are names on that wall that belong to men who died because of missions I planned, good men who followed orders they didn't fully understand, going into situations that were more dangerous than they knew." Morrison remained silent, sensing that Walsh was about to share something significant. "The thing about legends," Walsh continued, "is that they usually skip over the ugly parts, the failures, the times when everything went wrong despite the best planning and preparation." "But your record," Morrison protested. "Every mission was successful. You never failed." Walsh turned to look at him with those piercing blue eyes. "Son, that's where you're wrong. I failed plenty of times. The difference was that my failures were classified so deep that they might as well have never happened. The successes became legends. The failures became state secrets." Morrison felt his worldview shifting. Throughout his career, he had strived to emulate the perfection that men like Silver Sky represented. The idea that even the most legendary operators had known failure was both disturbing and oddly comforting. "Why did you disappear?" Morrison asked. "The official records say you died in 1975. Walsh was quiet for so long that Morrison wondered if he was going to answer. Finally, the old man spoke, his voice heavy with memory. "There was a mission in Cambodia. Officially, we were never there. The United States had no operations in Cambodia at that time. But there was a North Vietnamese supply depot that needed to be eliminated, and conventional forces couldn't touch it without creating an international incident." Morrison leaned forward, captivated despite himself. "I went in with a small team," Walsh continued. "Local assets, men who had been fighting that war long before America got involved. Good men, brave men. The mission was supposed to be simple. Get in, plant the charges, get out. Nobody was supposed to get hurt." The old veteran's hands clenched into fists, and Morrison could see the pain that still lived behind his calm exterior. "Everything went wrong. Intelligence was bad. There were civilians in the compound, families of the soldiers stationed there, children." Walsh's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late to abort. The charges were already set." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard rumors of operations like this. Missions that existed in the gray areas between warfare and terrorism, where good men were asked to make impossible choices. "I tried to evacuate the civilians," Walsh said. "Managed to get most of them out, but not all. When those charges went off," he trailed off, unable to finish. "The mission was still completed," Morrison said quietly. "Yes," Walsh replied bitterly. "The supply depot was destroyed. The strategic objective was achieved. But innocents died because of my actions, because of decisions I made." Morrison began to understand why a man like Silver Sky might choose to disappear, to let the world believe he was dead rather than continue carrying out such missions. "When I got back," Walsh continued, "the debrief was brief. Mission accomplished. Minimal casualties. The civilian deaths were classified, buried so deep that they became a footnote in a file that most people will never see. I was congratulated and given my next assignment." "But you didn't take it." Walsh shook his head. "I couldn't. That night in Cambodia changed something in me. I realized that I had become something I didn't recognize, a weapon pointed at problems that couldn't be solved with violence. But violence was the only tool I had." Morrison thought about his own career, the missions he had carried out without question, the times he had followed orders even when his instincts told him something was wrong. "So you staged your own death," he said. "It wasn't hard," Walsh replied. "I was supposed to die on that Cambodia mission anyway. The official story wrote itself. I just didn't correct anyone when they assumed the worst." "But where did you go? What did you do for all these years?" For the first time since revealing his identity, Walsh smiled genuinely. I became nobody special. Henry Walsh, Vietnam veteran, worked construction for 30 years, married a wonderful woman named Margaret. She passed 5 years ago. Raised 2 kids who think their father was just another grunt who came home and built a quiet life. Morrison stared at him in amazement. You gave up everything. The recognition, the career, the chance to serve your country. No, Walsh said firmly. I chose to serve my country differently. Every building I helped construct, every young veteran I mentored, every tax dollar I paid, that was service too. Just a different kind. The weight of Walsh's words settled over Morrison like a heavy blanket. He had spent his entire career chasing glory, seeking the kind of recognition and legendary status that men like Silver Sky represented. The idea that someone would willingly walk away from that seemed incomprehensible. Do you regret it? Morrison asked. Walsh considered the question carefully. I regret the things I did that I can never undo. I regret the people who died because of my actions. But do I regret choosing to step away from that life? No. Some wars are worth fighting, son, but some battles aren't worth winning if you lose yourself in the process. As the sun began to set over the memorial garden, Morrison found himself looking at everything differently. The names on the wall, his own career, the meaning of true service. It all seemed more complex now, more nuanced than the simple heroic narratives he had grown up believing. Silver Sky, the legend, had died in Cambodia in 1975. But Henry Walsh, the man, had found a way to live with honor and purpose beyond the shadows of classified operations and impossible missions. The weeks following the veterans' barbecue passed in a blur for Commander Morrison. He found himself distracted during briefings, questioning orders that he would have followed without hesitation just a month before, and lying awake at night thinking about Walsh's words. The legend of Silver Sky had been replaced by the reality of Henry Walsh, and Morrison wasn't sure how to reconcile the two. He had done his research in the days after their conversation, using his security clearance to dig deeper into files that few people had access to. What he found confirmed everything Walsh had told him and revealed even more disturbing details. The Cambodia mission was just one of dozens of operations where the line between heroism and horror had been impossibly thin. Morrison had always prided himself on his moral clarity. Good guys versus bad guys. Protect the innocent. Serve your country. But the more he learned about Silver Sky's real history, the more he realized that the world Walsh had operated in didn't allow for such simple distinctions. On a Friday afternoon, Morrison made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of heading home to his empty apartment, he drove to the address he had quietly obtained from the Veterans Administration records. Walsh lived in a modest ranch house in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from the base. The lawn was perfectly maintained, and the driveway held an old pickup truck that looked like it had been lovingly cared for over many years. Morrison sat in his car for several minutes, unsure of what he was going to say, but knowing he needed to see Walsh again. Before he could lose his nerve, he walked up to the front door and knocked. Walsh opened it almost immediately, as if he had been expecting the visit. "Commander," Walsh said with that same gentle smile, "I wondered if you might come by." The interior of the house was exactly what Morrison had expected. Clean, organized, and filled with the accumulated memories of a long, quiet life. Family photos covered the mantelpiece, showing Walsh with a beautiful woman who must have been Margaret and 2 children who had grown into successful adults. What caught Morrison's attention were the things that weren't there. No military memorabilia, no medals or commendations, no photographs or souvenirs from Walsh's time as Silver Sky. It was as if that part of his life had been deliberately erased. "Coffee?" Walsh offered, already moving toward the kitchen. They sat at a small table by the window overlooking the backyard, where a carefully tended garden showed signs of years of patient work. Morrison found himself studying Walsh's face, looking for signs of the legendary operative beneath the grandfather's gentle exterior. "You have questions," Walsh said. It wasn't really a question. Morrison nodded. "I've been reading the files I have access to, the real ones, not the sanitized versions." "And what did you learn?" "That you saved more lives than I can count. That operations you planned prevented wars that would have killed thousands. That intelligence you gathered helped end conflicts before they started." Walsh sipped his coffee quietly, waiting for Morrison to continue. "But I also learned about the costs, the people who died, the operations that went wrong, the choices you had to make that no person should ever have to make." "War asks impossible things of people," Walsh said simply. "That's nothing new." Morrison leaned forward. "But how did you do it? How did you carry out those missions knowing what the consequences might be?" Walsh was quiet for a long time, staring out at his garden. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. "I told myself I was serving a greater good, that the ends justified the means, that someone had to make the hard choices so that other people could sleep safely at night." He turned to look directly at Morrison. "And maybe that was true, at least some of the time. But it was also an excuse that let me avoid looking too closely at what I was becoming." Morrison felt a familiar chill. "What were you becoming?" "A man who could justify anything in the name of duty. A person who had stopped seeing the people affected by my actions as real human beings and started seeing them as variables in a strategic equation." The honesty was brutal and direct. Morrison realized that Walsh was showing him something that few people ever saw: the true cost of living in the shadows where moral absolutes didn't exist. "When did you know you had to stop?" Morrison asked. Walsh stood and walked to a framed photograph on a side table. It showed him in military dress uniform, young and confident, receiving what appeared to be a commendation from a high-ranking official. "The night I came home from Cambodia," Walsh said, picking up the photo. "Margaret was waiting for me. She always waited, even though I could never tell her where I had been or what I had done. She took one look at my face and asked me what had happened." Morrison waited, sensing that this was the heart of the story. "I couldn't tell her about the mission, couldn't explain about the children who died or the choices I had made, but I also couldn't lie to her anymore. So I said nothing. I just held her and cried for the first time since I was a child." Walsh set the photograph down gently. "She never asked me about my work again, but she didn't need to. She could see what it was doing to me, what I was becoming, and she loved me enough to wait for me to find my way back to being human." Morrison thought about his own isolation, the way his career had consumed everything else in his life. He had relationships, but none that went deeper than the surface. None where he could be vulnerable or admit uncertainty. "How did you do it?" Morrison asked. "How did you build a normal life after everything you had seen and done?" Walsh sat back down, his expression thoughtful. "It wasn't easy. For the first few years, I jumped at every sound. I couldn't sleep without checking all the locks twice. I kept expecting someone to figure out that Henry Walsh was really Silver Sky. But it got better? Slowly. Margaret helped, though she never really understood what she was helping me through. Work helped too. There's something healing about building things instead of destroying them. And time helped most of all." Morrison realized that he had come here looking for easy answers, but Walsh was offering him something more valuable and more difficult: the truth about the choices that lay ahead. "I've been thinking about my career differently since we talked," Morrison admitted, "questioning things I used to take for granted." Walsh nodded approvingly. "That's good. Questions are healthy even when they're uncomfortable, especially when they're uncomfortable. But I don't know what to do with the doubts. I've built my whole life around being a SEAL. It's who I am." "No," Walsh said firmly. It's what you do. Who you are is something deeper than your job or your rank or your security clearance. Morrison felt something shift inside him, a recognition that Walsh was right. For years, he had defined himself entirely through his military identity. The idea that he might be something more, or something different, was both terrifying and liberating. The man who was Silver Sky died in Cambodia, Walsh continued. But Henry Walsh got to live a full life, with love and family, and purposes that had nothing to do with warfare. Both men were real. Both served their country in their own way. As the afternoon light faded, Morrison found himself looking at his future differently. He didn't have all the answers yet, and he suspected that the questions Walsh had raised would follow him for a long time. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had permission to consider possibilities beyond the narrow path he had been following. When Morrison finally left Walsh's house that evening, he carried with him something more valuable than any intelligence briefing or tactical training he had ever received. He carried the knowledge that true strength sometimes meant choosing not to use all the power at your disposal, and that the greatest victories might be the ones that nobody else would ever know about. The legend of Silver Sky would live on in classified files and whispered stories. But Henry Walsh had found something more important. He had found a way to live with honor, purpose, and peace. And maybe, Morrison thought as he drove home through the quiet streets, that was the most successful mission of all.